He was not called the Golden State Killer at the time. He was known as the East Area Rapist. This is the kind of case I had hoped to work on someday in my career. He did escalate from burglary to sexual assault to sexual murder. He did almost the same thing every single time. And if things didn't go right for him, then he abandoned his plan. And sometimes that was with devastating consequences.
Welcome to Critical Incidents Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Ashley, a law enforcement veteran with over a decade of experience. Each episode, I'll be interviewing people about their own critical incident, a moment in their lives that shaped who they are today. From life-threatening emergencies to personal struggles, we'll hear firsthand accounts of resilience, determination, and the power of the human spirit. Join me through some of the most critical incidents that have changed people's lives forever. All right, Julia, can you go ahead and give us a background on who you are and what you did?
Sure. My name is Julia Cowley. I'm a retired FBI agent, and I was also a certified FBI profiler during my career with the FBI. Prior to that, I worked for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as a forensic scientist. So with that job, I had two sets of responsibilities. One was working in the laboratory. I was a forensic toxicologist. So I analyzed bodily fluids for drugs, alcohols, and toxins. Sometimes I'd get body parts to analyze to see if there may be poison in them. So it was interesting work, to say the least. I also did a lot of DUI cases. We did a lot of those.
Yeah.
In the crime lab, but we'd get a lot of sometimes death cases that were interesting, that were real mysteries, that I enjoyed working on those. And then the other part of my job, I was a member of the crime scene response team, or the violent crime response team, I think is what they called it at the time. So I would go out to homicide scenes and process those as part of my responsibilities with TBI. So it was a great experience. So that's my background in a nutshell.
That's really cool.
I should probably also clarify, when I started with the FBI, I didn't become a profiler right away. You have to spend years and years and years as an investigator. And I worked on white-collar public corruption and civil rights investigations during my time prior to going to BAU. And I was also a member of the FBI's evidence response team.
That's impressive. It's interesting. I didn't know that you done anything with DUIs. That piqued my interest. I was the lead DUI instructor for our county, and so we learned a whole lot about that, and it was a lot of fun going through that very serious stuff. It was one of those crimes that I felt had the biggest negative impact on the community when it comes to like your general nonviolent crime that can turn violent just based on, accidents and
Right. It can be devastating.
yeah.
The people driving under the influence, and I think we don't consider that a serious crime, but it can have absolutely devastating consequences. But yeah, that was the majority of my work in toxicology. So, it was pretty routine, and it was the same testing. You put it through the samples, go through the same process every time. And so that could get a little bit, I don't want to say boring.
Redundant, yeah.
It was very redundant. So I did enjoy when we had other cases that came in and there was more of a mystery, like, okay, this is coming from the medical examiner's office and they suspect maybe a poisoning or something like that. And so that was always, that was interesting to try to figure out, okay, what is the process I'm going to use to try to figure out what's in this sample. And then there's also times where, in our lab, we may not have the capabilities to do certain types of testing because there are certain types of substances that require very specific tests. You can't just do a screen and narrow it down like you can for most types of drugs of abuse and medications and things like that. So there might be times where you might suspect something, you'd have to send it to a laboratory that had the capabilities to do like specific types of tests for, unusual types of drugs that would not show up in a regular drug screen.
Yeah. There's been so many, and I'm sure you saw it too. There's so many drugs that came out through my career where spice was a thing for a while and you'd be impaired on that, and this kava stuff and different strains of fentanyl wasn't a thing when I first started. And I didn't see fentanyl
Right.
until later in my career, but drugs just evolved in the way that people abuse them.
Right. I remember once too, and that I had a DUI case, and the officer that submitted the sample, I couldn't find anything in the blood. Alcohol was negative. I did typical screening, and I said, I cannot find anything in the blood. And he was adamant. He's like, this person was under the influence, and they were eating or swallowing their money, like their coins. He's like, he was putting coins in his mouth and swallowing it. So it's acting really bizarre, and I just couldn't figure it out. So even I don't want to say a simple DUI case, but a case like that was kind of interesting to work on. Unfortunately, I never figured out what was going on, and I ended up just attributing it to maybe just a mental health break as opposed to being under the influence of anything. But I also, he was there on the scene, and it was his impression this person's under the influence of something, and so I have to take that into account. But that one I wasn't able to solve. The big white whale of my career,
Right?
this DUI case.
It's so wild that you run into those. I had one case, it was when I first became a police officer, where this guy, so I got a call. It was at an intersection of one of our major thoroughfares. There's a Hooters there. And the call came in. They said, hey, there's a guy in the parking lot flapping his arms like a chicken. And it was at like midnight, 1 a.m. So go over there. They gave me the description of the vehicle. I see it leaving, follow it. It's all over the place on the road. Make a traffic stop, go to put him through field sobriety just because he can't answer questions. We always ask them the psychophysical questions where it's like, do you have your license registration? What's your middle name? Just something where they're doing something physical and trying to answer a question. He couldn't figure it out, handed me a credit card, get him out of the car, field sobriety. That scene in Willy Wonka where he is standing there and he starts leaning forward like he's going to fall face forward and then does a roll? He did that while doing the field sobriety and just refused the rest of the test. He was just all over the place. Arrested him. Obviously, PBT came back with nothing. And so I took him for a blood test. And when I went to court, the prosecutor came with the defense attorney and said, this gentleman is a professor at a college, and he is like so smart, he does like social experiments. And so this was a social experiment that he did, and he had, this mental health thing going on, and it was the most bizarre thing. They dropped the case, and I was like, this is wild. And so
that is interesting. What police officers have to deal with sometimes, and people understand the bizarre situations that they deal with on a daily basis.
it is. It
Something
gets
new all the time.
It's entertaining though. You keep showing.
It can be entertaining, and then sometimes you have these entertaining stories, and then you have the danger that they're constantly in all the time.
Yes.
With the interactions that they're having with people that they don't know what may be motivating that person that they've encountered.
Yes.
They don't know them. They're trying to assess the amount of stress that and I was never a police officer, but I guess I can relate on some level to when you're encountering somebody that you don't know who they are. You don't know what their reactions normally are. You don't know if they have a weapon on them. You don't know if they're being honest with you. The stress that you go through and that you feel. And then imagine that all the time, every time you pull somebody over, every time you encounter someone or talk to someone, you just don't know. Very stressful.
Yeah. It can definitely get to you every once in a while. But, that's part of my history now. So all positive things moving forward. So it's interesting when I heard your background on getting into the FBI, you were first assigned to the Boston field office. Is that right? All right, so the Boston field office with you said public corruption, white collar crimes, things like that?
Yeah, I started out on a bank fraud squad, and I thought, what am I doing here? I had no financial background. So that's where I started, and I spent my first 3 years on that squad. And even though it was not my first choice for what I hoped to work when I joined the FBI, but I really learned a lot from that experience. I met my dearest friend in the FBI on that squad. We're still friends to this day. She's my best friend. And I learned how to do a detailed investigation, looking at documents. It was a way to just get started, but it was not what I expected. And then after that, after 3 years, I went to the public corruption civil rights squad where I absolutely loved it. Now, I had a good experience on bank fraud, but I can't say, oh, I loved it.
Yes.
It was a good experience. I learned from it, and there are a lot of great things about it, and I worked with great people. But going to the public corruption squad, the work itself, I really loved. There's a lot of variety to it. I worked with some phenomenal people. It was fantastic. It was a great experience.
Yeah, it's both of those. The financial stuff it's so interesting because it's not glamorous. It's not glory. It's a lot of data. And it's a lot of suspicious activity reports, all of these different things that kind of go into the financial fraud of it. When I worked in organized retail crime, that was a big part of it. Where are they fencing things and how do they move their money from places? Big part of that. It's not glamorous, but it does peel back the onion of organized crime, which generally leads to bigger fish to fry, I guess, really.
Yeah, I
But
I enjoyed it, and I like a good financial crime case, and I like listening and reading about financial types of white collar fraud cases. And ultimately when I went into the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, one of the reasons I think I was selected is because I had a white collar background, and they were starting to look at, and they were doing research on high level white collar offenders, which that's a fascinating personality type as well, and they're fascinating crimes. But it not only taught me to be very detailed. I mean, I think I was already detail oriented coming from a forensic science background, but it taught me to be detail oriented in a different way. It taught me, I learned that's the one thing about the FBI. They don't always put you where they just put you where they need you, not where you have experience. So that's it's the needs of the Bureau. That's a saying. And so when I got there, it was a steep learning curve, and I did learn a lot. And not only that, I got good at interviewing people because I still had to go, even though I had a lot of documents to review, I still had to go out and interview a lot of people and talk with them. And it's a slower pace than working on a reactive squad. So that was probably a good way to start out, having not the typical law enforcement background that, if I had been a police officer. So it was a good place to start.
Yeah, that's a really cool starting point. And so you got selected for the behavioral analysis unit. Do you have to apply for that, or
Yes.
You do? Okay, so how does that look?
So any internal job like within the FBI that you want to go to is typically there's an application process, and if you're in an office and you want to transfer to another squad, there's not a formal application process. But if it requires a transfer out of the division, usually that would require this application process. So the way the Bureau does it is they have, depending on the position, they have these things that they call competencies, and you have to write examples of how you demonstrate that particular competency. So, for example, let's say the competency is judgment. So you should say what the problem is, what you did about it, and what was the outcome. That's kind of the format. And each question, I forget how many words, you're limited in how many words you can use, like maybe 1,500 per question. It's not that easy.
Yeah, no.
Because sometimes you're trying to fit years worth of investigation into this little box of 1,500 words, and you want to hit the key points, and you want to make sure you're demonstrating that particular competency. And if you miss the mark on that, then you get rated down. And there's a way that they grade them to be fair. I don't know if it's always 100% fair, but there's a way. And so you go through that process. Some of these jobs require an additional interview, and then there's a selection made, and each person that has applied for that particular job will be ranked. And then that's ranked by that local office that you're applying to. So for me, it was the BAU, people in the BAU that are trained to evaluate applicants. They make selections, they rank those people, and then those rankings go to a board at FBI headquarters that makes sure that those rankings are all on the up and up.
Okay.
That they follow the criteria, and if there's anything that appears to be out of the ordinary in any way, that everything's recorded. So the discussions are recorded, so headquarters can listen to it and make sure that they weren't taking into account some things that maybe they shouldn't take into account. So like, for example, you have these competencies, and I think there's like 8 of them, and you have to write 2 examples, 6 or 8, and 2 examples for each of the competencies. And let's say they evaluate an employee on something else that's not part of a competency, like let's say leadership. They start talking about, well, this person was a great supervisor. Well, that's not part of the competency, so you can't take that into account, and so that would be unfair. So things like that could happen. But usually if that particular office or unit or somebody has picked and ranked people, usually those are the people that get selected. And then headquarters will also check and make sure that that particular employee doesn't have any disciplinary issues that are ongoing, or as I like to say, they put you in timeout somewhere.
Yep.
And that's information that the local office wouldn't have access to. So headquarters what they do, like these name checks to make sure that there's not anything ongoing that could, if impact that person's selection in the future. Like, let's say there's, a pending disciplinary action coming up. So they'll do the name checks, and then they'll make the final selection. So that's how it works.
Wow.
It's a pretty boring process, but
it's so interesting though. I mean, when we think about how do we move in different positions anywhere else, it is an interview style process. Sometimes it's a test, sometimes it's an interview, sometimes it's both. But, we're talking about the top law enforcement agency in the country. There's probably some standards that we would think of as absurd, right? So people that haven't gone through that, when you explain that just now, I'm thinking like, okay, so 2 answers for 6 to 8 questions. Is there like a time frame? So I started going off in my head like, oh, maybe this is much more in depth than what I thought.
It's hard. So when a job opens up, so that it'll be posted. There's like a website there's an internal FBI intranet. So it can only be accessed by FBI employees. And if you're, there's a place where you can go see all the job openings. So like if a particular job opens up, from the time that job opening is posted, you usually have 2 weeks to submit your application. And that is hard to do unless you've already, sometimes if you've already applied for another job and you didn't get it or something, you might have some of these competencies you could recycle or revamp a little bit or tailor toward the next job opening. But if you've never done it before, I remember when the job opened up and I wasn't expecting it to, so I wasn't prepared, and I went and told my supervisor, hey, a job opened up in BAU, I'm going to apply for it. He said, okay, I'll see you in 2 weeks. He's like, and I'm like, I just got to answer a couple questions. And it took me the full 2 weeks. And I had a lot of assistance. I had my supervisor who reviewed my application. I had some squad mates that reviewed my application and helped me make suggestions. My supervisor at the time was just invaluable because he'd been through the process himself actually a couple of times with jobs he'd applied for. So he knew what they would be looking for and really helped me write a certain way that I wasn't used to writing. And he's like, they have to be done a certain way. And so he really helped me. So I had a lot of help too, but it did take me full 2 weeks. I didn't get any casework done during that time. I'm pretty certain.
And is it, when you apply for that, is it a specific section in there, or is it,
Yes.
So they do have different sections of behavioral analysis?
Yes. So at the time I applied, there were only 3 units. There was the terrorism threat unit, which was BAU 1. There was the crimes against adults unit, which at the time was BAU 2. And then there was BAU 3, which was crimes against children. And so that's since changed. They've expanded and they've renumbered the units. But I wanted to be in the crimes against adults unit. And the opening at the time was specifically for that unit. And there had been, prior to that, there had been opening in the Crimes Against Children's unit, but that was not what I wanted to do. I didn't really have that. I had some background in that, and I probably could have been qualified to work in that unit, but it's just not what I wanted to do. I wanted to work crimes against adults, and I didn't have any terrorism experience. So that was out of the question, nor that just wasn't my area of interest in investigations anyways. But I didn't have, other than working on, major cases like 9/11, I really didn't have specific terrorism investigative experience. I was never on a terrorism squad. So yeah. So, and when I joined the FBI, I knew I wanted to be a profiler someday, or was hoping to, but also knowing I might never get that opportunity, and I might never get selected. But when I joined the FBI, that's also the unit I wanted to work, sort of what the BAU was known for.
Yes.
And serial murders and mass murders and these unusual, bizarre types of crimes against adults.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I wanted to do.
And that's like the TV show Criminal Minds. That's what it's
It
like
was
kind of based on?
exactly like that.
Yeah.
Every day. Yeah. Yeah, that's what Criminal Minds is based off of. And one of my predecessors in the unit, at least at some point, I don't know if he still does, he was a writer on Criminal Minds.
Wow.
So that's kind of a fun fact. But yeah, that's what Criminal Minds is based off of, but the reality is completely different.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure they.
Not nearly like that at all.
No, in the show they do things very fast, and I can't imagine that in real life it goes that fast.
No, it really doesn't. It takes forever. And not only that, on the show, and I haven't seen every single episode, but I've watched it, and I watch shows like that. I think they're fun. But they show that the BAU agents are out there making arrests. They're out there interviewing killers and stuff like that. That's not what BAU is. BAU, although it's considered an operational unit, we are not the investigators. We are consulting with investigators. We don't take over their case. It remains their case. All we do is we provide an analysis, and it's them. They can take it or leave it, or they can take part of it and they can leave parts of it. It's really up to them, but we don't take over. We don't become part of the investigation. We just advise. We're like another set of, eyes taking a look at the case, and it's just an outside view. So I think that's where the show is completely different than the reality of being in the unit. Is that people think we're out there always like interviewing serial killers every day and interrogating them. That just doesn't happen. It's not the show. Or it's not like the show.
Yeah. All right. So when you get selected and you go to Quantico, right? Is that where the
yeah. So it's actually not on the Quantico base, but it is in Northern Virginia. There's an office there in Northern Virginia that's near Quantico.
Okay.
So yeah, but we're not at the academy.
You're not at the academy.
Yeah.
And so what does the schooling look like for that? Or like when you get accepted and you're like, congratulations, you've been accepted. What training or schooling do you go through, and what's the criteria for that?
Is this for BAU? Specifically?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the training, at least when I was there, it was 16 weeks of classroom, and every single day, 8 hours a day in a classroom. And now sometimes, we spent a week at the FBI laboratory learning about all the different units and how they could be helpful, because sometimes when you're working on cases, you may advise, hey, this is a case that might be, if you sent this evidence to this unit at the FBI laboratory. So, they wanted us to be familiar with all of that. We spent a week at the Baltimore County Medical Examiner's office looking at autopsies and learning about death investigations and things like that. And then we have people that came in, outside experts in crimes against children and sexual abuse, psychopathy. All different topics. These outside experts would come and teach us. Then we'd also do cases, like work on cases with profilers that were already certified profilers, and we'd work through them as if we were the profilers. And that was a good learning experience as well. So those were always, I really enjoyed those days when we had case examples to work on. So it's pretty in depth. Yeah. It's a long 16 weeks, but it was also fascinating. And then after that, you have a certain number of types of cases that you have to work on with like a mentor, and depending on the unit. So at the time, I had to work 2 cases in each unit. So I had to work 2 terrorism cases, 2 crimes against children, and 2 crimes against adults under the supervision of a certified profiler. And then I also had to participate, it was a lot, in a number of consultations. I think there had to be like 4 types of consultations in each unit on a subject. I mean, it was like you have to sit in on like one serial rape case. You have to sit in on this type of case. And so, and that means you're just, you're not the lead, you're not writing a report, but you're assisting in the consultation process. Then there's also some requirements to teach certain courses outside the FBI and inside the FBI. So you have to give a presentation somewhere. It's like, it's a lot. You have a
Yeah.
checklist, and that amount of work, depending on, sometimes it depends a little bit on luck on the types of cases that you get, but, and diligence, like how diligent you're going to be. So it takes about a year to 2 years to get your certification in profiling. And even when you have your certification in profiling, you're not just let go. You're always working cases with other people. You're never just on your own, because you just can't profile a case on your own. You might have some ideas, but it's always good to have a team of people.
Yeah.
Checks and balances there. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow, that's a whole lot. It's like a field training program, but for years.
Yeah, it's almost, in some ways you're starting over again. Now, every profiler that comes in, or future profiler that comes in, already has a number of years of investigative experience. You don't come right in from the training academy.
Yeah.
You're not a new agent. Most agents have anywhere between 8. I mean, I knew one agent, she had 17 years. She's actually on my podcast. She had 17 years as an investigator before she was selected for BAU. So very, very experienced investigators. And when I got into the unit, I had 10 years in the, so you have that investigative background already, which is obviously necessary to,
Yes.
And some people, they get a little disappointed when they find out I got to be an agent for 10 years first before I can go to BAU, because it's a lot of work. And then when you get to BAU, you're being exposed to things maybe you never investigated before. I didn't have a psychology background, but I'm learning a lot about, psychology and abnormal psychology, and, functions of how the brain functions from, biologists. I mean, it was the things I'd never really been exposed to before.
That's a lot of information, I assume, to digest. But I guess once you already have the base level investigation, especially at the federal level, so that's even more in depth than what local and state usually does. But to take that and then to start understanding, what kind of person would do certain crimes? How is the evaluation done in the criteria that you're looking for?
Well, every case, it's a case-by-case basis, literally. But one of the things, I mean, I think everyone has their strong suit. So I would not consider psychology my strong suit. I would consider forensics my strong suit. So, and I approach a case maybe differently than a colleague who had a different background would approach it. But for me, it was always like, I always wanted to start with the crime scene photographs and the autopsies and the lab results, and figure out sort of what happened physically in that scene. And once I would get that down, then it was, rely on some of my colleagues that had a stronger background in psychology and those types of areas to help maybe explain what may be going on psychologically with that person. So that was my process. And it's really just like, so you just sort of go, why did they do that? And every bit of it, you're thinking, what is the motive behind doing that? What is the purpose behind doing that? And then you're also applying some behavioral concepts that that we tend to rely upon. And are they 100%? No. They're not 100%. So just because you're seeing a set of behaviors at a crime scene doesn't always mean 100% this is what that means, but in all probability, because that's what criminal profiling is. It's all about probabilities. What's most probable? So, you're never going to come up with exactly, okay, this is exactly who did this. We're pretty right, though.
Yeah.
We tend,
Yeah.
and I know behavioral, and I'm, coming from a hard science background, I believe in the science. I believe in forensic science. DNA evidence will trump behavior every time for me. Like, I'm not going to say, well, that doesn't fit the profile if the DNA matches you, right? So, I understand that there's not a lot of empirical research to say that that behavioral analysis works, and because it isn't always right. You're never going to be 100% right. But oftentimes, when we go through these cases and we get the case gets solved, and we go back and we look, and we can start to see, okay, this was right, this was right. It's really hard sometimes when you really, if you have a really good understanding of a crime scene and the dynamics and what occurred between the offender and the victim, you get a really good understanding of what likely happened and what was likely the motive and who would likely be responsible and what characteristics could we expect to see outside of the crime itself in this particular person. I've found that it has been an extremely useful tool for investigators to help particularly prioritize suspects and understand motivation, understand victimology. It's a useful process, but does it solve crimes? It does not. Excuse me. It doesn't solve crimes. That's a myth. And it will not, we'd say we can prioritize potential suspects, but it will never identify an offender. And I think that's just been sort of a misconception about profiling, that it's 100%. So
I know what we always see on TV and the movies is never what we're doing in real life.
I mean, we receive, criticism for our show and behavioral analysis in general. And I understand that criticism coming from the background that I come from. I understand, but I know we've been helpful to investigations, and I feel like we do a pretty good job in our assessments.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's how I.
Yeah, it's crazy. So there's a couple of, you did some high profile cases, and there's a few questions about those cases I wanted to ask you, but I wanted you to kind of go through and explain what case, obviously it's the big one is the Golden State Killer case. If you can, I don't know, go through like, how did that come across your desk, and what was your involvement in all that?
So the Golden State Killer, he was not called the Golden State Killer at the time. He was known as the East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. He had two monikers. And that was because he had committed a series of sexual assaults in Northern California in the Sacramento area, and then later committed some homicides in the Southern California area. And those were not connected until about 2001 through DNA. And even then, not all of the crimes were connected. It was a little bit later that every one of them got connected. But so he kind of flew under the radar. So he had the moniker East Area Rapist up in Sacramento, and then they called him the Original Night Stalker for the murders in Southern California. And they call him the Original Night Stalker because they already had the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. So he was the original one. But I had seen a show, and it was on A&E, an A&E special in 2000. I think it was in 2004, and it was an A&E special on this series of crimes, and that was the first I'd ever heard of it. I think I might have heard of the East Area Rapist, but I did not know the connection to the murders down in Southern California, and this is what I'm like, oh, these are connected. This is really interesting, and I just was interested in the case, followed the case. And then when I got to BAU, I had told my supervisor at the time that it was my hope someday to be able to work on a serial murder case. And, I know people think we're always working on serial murder cases in the unit, but there's not a lot that we're always working on all the time. Usually we have some involvement in every serial murder case that goes on, but we're not constantly working. Most of the cases were single homicides, and that were one-offs that were not related to a series. So I had just requested if, someday if you get a new one in, I would like to work on it. And one day he called me into the office, and by this point I I think I had gotten my certification. I was pretty new. And he said, "Have you ever heard of the East Area?" And I said, "East Area Rapist?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I just said, "I'll take it. I'll take the case." I knew he was calling me in to assign it to me.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and what had happened was the investigators in California had all gotten together, and so this offender was responsible for crimes in 15 jurisdictions. So they had finally all gotten together, formed a working group, and they were sharing information. The FBI's VICAP, which is the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, had put together a database for everyone to go in and be able to look at each other's cases and compare notes. And it really just was like, we're going to put this effort into identifying this offender, whatever it takes. We're all going to get together. And part of that was, well, let's have a profile done. And that's where I came in. And so I worked on it for about 2 years and put together a profile, put together some suggestions, some investigative suggestions at the time. Of course, this is back in 2012-ish. So prior to forensic genetic genealogy.
Mm-hmm.
It was, it's the case, like, if I look back on my career, and I worked on a lot of really interesting cases, but when I joined the FBI, this is the kind of case I had hoped to work on someday in my career. And I feel extremely fortunate to have been a small part of that. That was, just seeing it on TV. And then even when I watched that A&E special, one of the lead detectives ended up being part of the working group that I later became a part of, at least during the time I was analyzing the case, because you don't, like I said, I don't continue investigating. I'm just there as a resource. But he was there, so it was a little surreal. I was like, I saw you on that A&E special so many years ago.
Yeah.
So I ended up working with him, and we became friends.
Wow. That's so cool. It's it's always a small world, when you start getting into things like that, but
Yeah.
how did they determine what cases would fall into the appropriate pool, right? So obviously there were specific cases in which the original Night Stalker was doing things, but how would they, I can't imagine that was those crimes happen all the time, especially in California, probably in the early 2000s and all, and late 90s and through there. So what made the difference of like, okay, so we believe that this crime in particular was involved with this particular offender?
Well, in that particular case, you asking sort of how they linked it?
Yeah, how did they link all these crimes from different jurisdictions to that?
Well, a lot of it was due to behavior. He had a very distinct pattern of behavior, probably the most distinct pattern I have ever seen in my whole career. Like, it was so obvious when, like, I would read incident reports with victims, like, they describe what happened and how he came into their house and what he said to them, and like within the first few lines I'd be like, this is him, this is him. It was so behaviorally, so in the cases where they didn't have the DNA, part of my job was to link them behaviorally. And I'm going to tell you, it didn't take a rocket scientist to link these behaviorally, because they were so similar. And he did almost the same thing every single time. And if things didn't go right for him, then he abandoned his plan. And sometimes that was with devastating consequences. But so that's, you're just looking at like the repetitive behavior that he engaged in was how a lot of these crimes were linked to him. Now, there was a series prior to the sexual assaults occurring in Sacramento, which began in 1976. There was a series of ransackings in Visalia, California, which is about 4 hours from Sacramento. And they called this offender the Visalia ransacker. And back in the day, so this is like from 72 to 74. And back in the day, Visalia, the detectives there thought possibly that their ransacker could be the East Area Rapist. And there's a little bit of a divide, because they went up to Sacramento, and this is all, through storytelling.
Yeah.
Like from what I heard, stories passed down through the years. So Visalia goes up to Sacramento, and we think our ransacker is your rapist. And they were told, no, they're not the same. So there was a disagreement. And so when I got involved in the investigation, and this becomes important because the ransacker did commit a murder. It was not similar to the eventual sexual murders that he committed, but it was in fact a murder. So it's like people are wondering, is that where he started? Is this the same person? Because that could be an important link in trying to identify who this person was. And when I got involved in the working group or task force, there was a divide. You had detectives that did not believe that it was the same guy, and you had detectives that did believe it was the same guy. And part of my job was to make that link or not. And I linked them together. I thought it was the same person. And there were, again, some very distinct behaviors. Even though in the ransacking cases, there were no sexual assaults. The one murder was in some ways similar because it was sometimes he would commit murder in reacting to a victim's resistance to him. And then you had the other ones that were just part of the sexual motivation. But I did link them together. And ultimately, that became helpful in not specifically identifying him, but when they were doing the forensic genetic genealogy, it gave them another data point or data points. So the investigator said that it helped them identify him more quickly than they would have otherwise. They would have eventually gotten there, but it just happened a little faster because of that link. So that's how it can help.
Yeah.
Oh,
And I guess going back and looking at that from the 70s, do you kind of evaluate like this person's learning how they're going to do things? Like they're just getting started with these things? Does that kind of build and grow over time?
Yeah. I mean, you can definitely see that with him now. So what's really interesting is when he started the sexual assaults in Sacramento, the first one, I was like, he's done this before, but it was the first one. They didn't have anything else. So I just thought either he got really lucky or, and this just went very well for him, or he had done it before. And so that was my impression. But the issue was we didn't have any other cases to link to him. So, but in looking at it, I thought at the time, because I didn't have any other cases other than the ransackings, that's where he started. But now that I know more, I think he actually started before that. And I just didn't have those cases to look at the time. I think there was, there may be some suspicion, but they were never provided in the working group as being related to the series. And so I think he had started burglary even earlier. And there may be a case out there that he's responsible for that's never been identified as him. So I don't know. Did I answer your question? I don't know.
You did. Yeah, it's like,
I just started talking. I forgot what the question was.
It's so interesting because as people that consume information, right? So we all consume information. And when these cases come out and there's, TVs, documentaries, and movies and all these things about it, we hear the start to finish because it's already been investigated. But as a profiler, I would think that once that person has been identified and arrested, then you're connecting these cases and you can start now going back and reviewing from the beginning. Like, okay, I can see here, this is when he started developing X, Y, and Z and how he did things or how he operated or what he did prior to. And so I think that that's an interesting evaluation of the work that's put into it, is watching the growth of someone do that.
Yeah. And I think too, you can see that even without him being identified, you can see where he's learning and developing. But like I said, he started out pretty proficient. Like he did escalate from burglary to sexual assault to sexual murder. You see that evolution. But when you look at the crime, like the underlying crimes, the burglaries, which were key to his offending, that was really important to him to have that burglary aspect to his crimes, which is actually common in, or we've seen it in other serial sexual murderers. But so you have that evolution. But when you look back just on his beginning crimes, he's pretty proficient from the beginning to almost the end, I felt like the last murder, I think he was deteriorating. I don't know what was going on with him exactly, but it just seemed to be not his normal, if it, he wasn't as efficient as he had been. And there were a couple cases where it didn't go well for him and he was almost caught. And so he had some bumps in the road. But I mean, it just makes me wonder what else could be out there. I don't want to be like alarming anybody or
Sure.
conspiracy theory, because I do think there have been other crimes that people have tried to connect to him that I don't think he's responsible for. But I think there could be something out there just never got identified. And or it's just sitting there somewhere and nobody ever investigated it, or it was forgotten about. But maybe there's something other that, some other crime, serious crime, not just burglary, but something more than that he might have done prior to the ones that we know for sure.
Yeah. It's, working in law enforcement, I don't know how, like, prospectively looking at it, people get away with this for so long. We have on the local level, when I think about, like, I've investigated burglaries and, homicides and things like that, there's always somebody, like a homeowner's going to stop them or be able to, I guess cameras weren't really a thing back then, but so it seems interesting that people get away with it for so long.
Yeah. And, he had some close calls. He was chased by a couple of people. In one case, he was chased by an FBI agent who lived next door to the victims that he attacked. And the FBI agent heard screaming, hopped in his car, chased him, and he got away. He had some close calls. He had one victim who broke out of his bindings. I actually had two. That one of them, I don't think he actually got the bindings on and all the way. So he had some incidents where he just got. It was just extremely lucky. Plus, he was trained prior. He was a police officer prior, and he was fit. He outran people. He was strong and capable in many ways.
Yeah.
So
worst case
part
scenario
of it was not necessarily luck, but training. And I think too, part of it, everyone, a lot of times we see people that are good at crimes and we think, oh, they must have some sort of formal law enforcement training. That's what people thought about, this particular offender. And so I don't like to jump in and say, yeah, there's some training there. But ultimately I thought, yeah, there's some training there.
Yeah.
He's good at what he does. But sometimes offenders become good at what they do because they do it a lot. And it may not be that they have any formal training. So you have to kind of differentiate between, okay, what appears to be maybe some formalized training as opposed to somebody who has just gotten really good at what they're doing because they do it a lot.
Yeah. Wow. And so you got that case, and then you worked on the Israel Keys case. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So our involvement, and I was not the lead on Israel Keys. So just to clarify,
Sure.
I don't have the all the goods, but I did participate in it with my colleague, one of the colleagues that's on my show. We all did it actually, but we got involved with the disappearance of the couriers in Vermont. They were a couple and they disappeared, and we were involved very early on because this was an unusual crime. They just disappeared out of the house. Their car was found. The car was gone, and there were clear signs that there was a break-in or something bad had happened. And so we, profiled that case, gave interview suggestions, and then the following year we were involved in the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig up in Alaska. And we worked on that, and we were involved early on in there, even prior to her being found, prior to Keys being caught. So both these cases involved early on. And then at some point, they've caught Israel Keys, and we learn that he's confessed to having kidnapped and murdered a couple out of Vermont. And there were a lot of calls trying to verify, is there a case like this? And then we started putting it all together. It was probably the most shocked any of us have ever been that these were connected. There's, I guess hindsight, you look back and you see the similarities in aspects of these crimes, but there is no way we would have ever connected it, even if they were really, really similar, unless you had maybe some like strong forensic evidence that linked both of them. The victimologies were very different. You can't really get geographically, you can't get more further away. I mean, it's almost, It's
Yeah.
about as far as you can get.
Yeah.
And we just never put it together. And I just remember thinking, what? These are connected? It was really shocking. Yeah.
When you give suggestions for interviews, how do you evaluate that? Because just what I can understand is, when I've done interviews and interrogations, the person's personality plays into that where, does this person want us to hear like, oh my gosh, we're so impressed? Or do they want to say, oh, it's not that big of a deal? So how do you evaluate that and then give that insight into interviewing someone of this caliber?
hmm Well, depends. It's case by case. In this case, we didn't give interview strategies like we normally do. This was just kind of ongoing with them, and there was a lead agent that was advising, try this or try this. But in general, when we're going to give an interview strategy and there's time to prepare, it's surprising. Like I know one detective once said, I think he actually said it. We had him on our show as a guest. He said, I'm going to tell you, if you work with BAU, it's like putting together a book report. We ask a lot.
Yeah.
And what we usually have people do is fill out what we call a general assessment questionnaire. And we'll have them do that for victims in order to develop victimology, but we'll also do that for suspects or witnesses we want to interview to just try to have a really good understanding of who they are, what their personalities are like, and to see if we can come up with, or at least, this isn't going to sound right, but just try to find the areas where they might be vulnerable to law enforcement questioning. And every person is different. There's no, like, our approach isn't, okay, you have to do this and you have to do this, you have to come up with this theme. And we tailor those interviews specifically for that person. So even if you have a serial killer, even a serial sexual murderer, the interview strategy for somebody like Joe D'Angelo, Golden State Killer, it was very different than it would be for Dennis Rader, say, the BTK. They're very different people and different killers and different, ultimately their motivation is the same, but they're different. And so the approach that was taken with Dennis Rader would never have worked with Joe D'Angelo. And in fact, Joe D'Angelo never talked. And so that again is like a myth about serial killers. They all want to talk. They don't all want to talk. And that's a really good example of somebody who just never wanted to talk about his crimes. And it's because he's a different person. So, but every interview strategy is different. And you have to base it on that individual person.
Yeah. And so
at least from the BAU perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so, there's so much that goes into it, just from hearing everything that you're talking about. I try to put myself like, what, how would I evaluate these things? And there's so much information to consume and experience you have to have in those specific areas that it's extremely fascinating to be able to do that. And so that is really awesome to have that.
And if you have the time, like some of these interviews, you get this one chance.
Mm-hmm.
You get one chance, and let's make the most of it. Let's not try to wing it and hope they'll talk, or, and sometimes you're just going to be out of luck. They're going to say, I want an attorney, or they just won't talk. And that's really hard to get around. But that happens a lot. But if you have somebody that might be willing to talk, but they need the right motivation, that's what we're trying to provide. And you don't need to do this for every single interview like you're doing. Like, we don't put that much work or tell anybody to put that much work when you're just going to go out to talk to somebody about something that, isn't super important. But if you have that one opportunity to talk to somebody or a particular person that could provide really important information, you want to get it right. So put the time in to try to, make the most of it.
Yeah.
And to, help your chances of getting that information that you're looking for.
Most certainly. I know that, looking at all these cases, and did you go out to the scene of all these places or some of them and kind of see it?
Some of them, yeah.
Some of it.
So we didn't travel on every case. That's like another myth there.
Yeah.
But we tried to travel on the ones when we could. Just the volume of work we had to do didn't make it possible to travel on every case. But there are some cases that, you needed to see for yourself. Now, if there was a particular case where the crime scene's been significantly altered and there's no point in trying to go see it and you're going to rely on the photographs, you might not travel for that one. But if you have a crime scene that hasn't been altered, it's the same, it can be very helpful. So in those cases, we would try to travel. And certainly on the bigger cases where you had large groups of detectives meeting, like with the Golden State Killer, that was important for us to be present and meet with them in person and give our assessment. I traveled out there a few times, not only to gather information, but I gave an initial assessment, and then my colleagues and I went back out and gave our kind of our final assessment. But during that time, did travel. We didn't get to every scene, but we saw most of them, at least in the couple of the two trips that we took. I went once to the Northern California area and then Southern California. I didn't get to everything in Southern California, but I got to everything in Northern California. But that was because it was pretty condensed. Yeah. And then the really interesting thing about that particular case is that a lot of these neighborhoods have not changed a lot.
Really?
The houses look the same. Yeah, there were a few where there'd been some remodels done, but for the most part, the neighborhoods that we saw, and he tended to pick the same types of houses. So getting a sense for like one neighborhood, if you went a couple streets over where there was another attack, it looked just the same. So you got a real sense of the types of houses he was interested in breaking into. And I think that was a big part of his selection process, is making sure he was entering houses where he would know the layout. And they were single story ranch style homes that had similar layouts. That was his comfort zone.
Yeah. Wow. That is interesting. I mean, it would make sense to pick the same houses with the same layouts for familiarity, and you have the
And he
advantage.
happened to live in one of those very same houses when he was arrested. He didn't go very far. He was very familiar with the area. But then you get a sense too, as sometimes you get to an area and you're like, wow, this is much smaller and more confined than I expected it to be, or it's much more expansive, and it just gives you more of a sense of what could have happened, or it just gives you a different perspective. So there's no substitute than going to the crime scene to see it when possible, and if it hasn't been significantly altered.
Yeah. And, seeing all those things, in law enforcement, and obviously when you're talking about what you're doing, you see things, and, I know that they had to have messed with you in some way, shape, or form. So how did you kind of deal with that, or decompress, or take away? I know that we had spoken about this prior to the interview, but one of the things that always came up with me was, if I went to a crime scene and, there was a homicide that happened, and on the calendar, and I think we were talking about this, it was like their mom's birthday was written on there like 2 days later. And so it's like, oh, and you start thinking about, they were planning on doing this. They had these things already put in place. Like they were looking forward to the next thing in their life, and now that's gone. So how do you, from your perspective in the FBI, kind of process all that?
Yeah, and I can relate to that. The personal effects of victims and the family members was always the hardest part for me. That's where I could handle the crime scene itself, victims' injuries. But if I saw, sometimes there'd be these times where I'd see something personal, like you just described, something on the calendar, and it just hits you how quickly life can be taken. Like it really hits you. Like people are just going about their normal everyday lives, and then all of a sudden something happens. And I had a case, this is back when I was with TBI, and the woman who was killed was in the middle of working on her crossword, and she had it still on her lap, and she had the pencil in her hand still. And that hit me. And in fact, it was at that same crime scene, and I walked into their guest room, and it was a couple, elderly couple, who had been murdered, and they had all their Christmas presents for their grandchildren wrapped on the bed. And I looked at one of the tags, and it's still hard to think about those things And that, like in that moment, that hit me.
Yeah.
And you just have to take a deep breath and get right back to work, just like I'm going to do right now. So but those things, time and time again, you see crime scene photos, and you see, in one of the Golden State Killer cases, there was just, stuff on the countertops, and people are just in the middle of stuff, in the middle of life. But the way I always coped, I like to run. So exercise was good for me. I have very strong family support. So being home and being with my family is always a great comfort. I don't want to say it distracts me, because I'm always thinking about my work, because I do really enjoy it. It fascinates me. It consumes me in some ways. But I have a great support network, not just from the family that I grew up with, but, with my husband and my kids. And that just gives me so much comfort. But when at BAU, my colleague Susan and I, we'd always go, we get to work early, go for a run. And that's how we'd start our day. And that was really helpful. And sometimes we talk about work and talk about cases and process what, we talk about one of our cases with each other. And other times we just talk about completely different things, but it was very therapeutic. But it gets to you after a while. And then I found as a parent, I tend to probably worry about things that are just not going to happen, and maybe ruin some fun sometimes. I will, but I feel compelled to say, you be careful if you're going to go on that hike. Don't go off the trail, and you stay together. And if
Yes.
that those kinds of things where, I think that's just, I feel compelled to,
Yeah.
warn my kids of things that are very unlikely going to happen, and it's probably not always healthy for them.
Well, when you've seen it so many times, that's what goes through your head, and you'd almost feel, I don't know, you'd almost feel like an overwhelming sense of guilt if you didn't say anything about it, because
Right.
you've seen situations go south that way. Think about, Heather, we're talking about this where, before law enforcement, like when we first, started dating, like what was it like having just the ignorance to what exists in the world, right? So you don't know about the crime rates in the neighborhoods you lived in. You didn't know about the things that happened in the world. And then when you do know, it has a completely different outlook on life. And you have to take that with a grain of salt and evaluate situations as they come. And you do things
Yeah.
like that. And you tell your kids, like, hey, just be careful.
Yeah. Well, I look back at my youth, and we were the most reckless kids. And, it's just back in the 70s and too. And obviously there were dangers out there, but we were running around the neighborhood all day, and parents didn't know where we were.
Yeah.
We were, I wasn't a criminal, but I wasn't up to good things sometimes. I mean, but we did a lot of crazy things as kids, and I had no sense of worry or danger. And raising my own kids like that, they don't have that either. And so I'm trying to say, but I know how I was.
Yeah.
And even as a young adult, even in my early years as an FBI agent, I probably don't worry the same way as I do now, having seen everything that I've seen. And, you do come to realize how, especially when, you're retired and getting older, and you start to realize you really know how precious life can be,
Very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all of the insights and everything. Can you tell us about your podcast? Because it is, it's something that I started listening to when we spoke last time. And then, obviously I'm listening to Brett and Alice and the prosecutors and everybody that's kind of connected there. So can you tell us about your podcast and where we can go find it?
Sure. Yeah. So it's called The Consult, Real FBI Profilers. And I do the show with 3 of my colleagues from the Behavioral Analysis Unit. They're also retired FBI profilers. And we look at various cases. Some of the cases are solved. Some of them are unsolved. Some of them we worked on when we were at BAU. And some of them are ones that we've looked at since BAU that are some maybe high profile cases. And it exactly what you would hear if we were sitting in the room at BAU. So it's not scripted. I mean, I do an introduction and I end it, but it's not a scripted. It's just a discussion. It's really a discussion about criminal behavior, what we're seeing in the crime scene. We'll talk about offender characteristics, depending on the question that we're trying to answer with a particular case. We may be looking, okay, was this, in a disappearance? Was it foul play? Did the person disappear on their own? Was it an accident? Sometimes we'll try to hone in on those answers. So, but it's very similar to all the types of cases that we worked at BAU. And it's not because it's profiling. We don't always have all the answers. So it's it's all based on probabilities. And we talk a lot about behavior and what we think, but we're also very careful to say if we don't have all the information all the time, and if we had another piece of information that might change the profile. And then I also do interviews with people to kind of break it up. The cases that we do take a lot of time and a lot of emotional energy. So it's nice to have some interviews that are maybe, lighter hearted, although some people, like I did an interview with a polygrapher and it was a great interview and it was much more lighthearted. But then some people are like, I don't believe in polygraphs. And
Oh,
they got mad at me.
goodness.
Just a few, but
Yeah.
it wasn't, it's just like, I want to learn a little bit more because we always talk about polygraphs, oh, this person passed or this person didn't. What does that mean? And, how much weight are we going to give that? And then what else about the show? We've had some detectives on that we've worked with that have come to talk about cases that got solved and how they got solved and the profile, like how accurate was that? So that's always fun to have the detectives back on. So, and then we've had one case where it's an open homicide case, and the investigators came on to talk about that, and we hope to do more cases like that. We have an upcoming case of an open unsolved homicide in which an investigator is going to come on and talk to us about it, help spread the word.
That's so
I think
cool.
I've learned through doing the show that my passion, I like the lesser known, older, unsolved cases. Those aren't the ones that are the most popular, but for me, they're the most rewarding and they're the ones that need the attention. And I really enjoy doing those. And somebody had said it's kind of a historical look. It's like a history class sometimes because you go back so many years in some of these cases that you have to put yourself in a different time and understand what things were like at that time. But those cases have been extremely rewarding because working with some of the families, they don't want their loved one to be forgotten. And some of these cases are, 50 years old now.
Yeah.
So.
And, I'm sure it's very rewarding, I'm sure, for you, but also for the victims' families to get hopefully an answer at some point, or at least a better understanding. I think that's fantastic. And,
I always have hope.
Yes.
I do. I see cases through my career that I don't want to say, I always think things are going to get solved because I always know someday science is going to, I think even with the Golden State Killer, I knew science was going to solve that case. They had DNA. So anytime you have that, you can feel pretty good. And so I knew someday, and sure enough, that's what happened. But I just had a case. I had done a profile. It was a murder from the 70s, and it was a double homicide. There was no DNA, and there was a bloody fingerprint at the scene, and it seemed like somewhat of a random crime. So it was a difficult case. Well, I just happened to be looking at like a headline that came across my phone in the news, and I'm like, wait, that sounds familiar to me because it was in the town that I had done a double homicide in, and so I read through it, and sure enough, it was a case I had profiled a long time ago, and somebody out of the blue just called in to the law enforcement agency and said, I know who did this. They gave a name. And then when they found the guy, when they got his name, they found that he had applied for a taxi cab license or something, and had given his fingerprints like back in 2000. And of course, this crime happened in the 70s. So they had his fingerprint on file, and the fingerprint, they go and match, and it was matched the bloody one at the crime scene.
Whoa.
And they had no other, they had other evidence, but that was the solid forensic evidence that they have, and that's public knowledge, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
So I can talk about that. But I mean, I'm like, just the thought, like, even if you don't have that DNA, you might get that call. And I don't know the circumstances of who made that call. I mean, I'm sure it's going to come out at some point, but it was amazing to me. And so you can never give up. You always have to have hope with these cases because you never know. And sometimes with these older cases, time can be a benefit because you have, relationships that change and you have advances in technology. And these are the things that will benefit these older cases.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, technology is really coming at like a rapid speed. We went down to Texas to Othram the DNA, where they're extracting DNA, and looked at the process of that. And what they're doing is trying to make the samples as small as possible so they don't waste the evidence. And then the amount of profiles they can run that through. I mean, it's amazing to see where technology has come in just the past decade. It's wild.
Yeah, it is amazing. It's something that when I started my career, I always know, like, it's amazing things can be done. But when you're not in that field or you don't have an understanding of that particular science, you don't really know what could be done.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, what I've seen in my career it's just amazing.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We greatly appreciate it, the insight on everything. And, I've learned a whole lot about the FBI, about what profilers are up to. And it's really cool to see that I didn't know that they didn't take over the case. I honestly thought like, oh, we're going to put a profile on it, profiler. They got it now. We're good.
Yeah. Nope.
No, that's really cool.
That's a myth.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like on TV, it's like the joke. We're the FBI. We're here.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't worry.
We got it from here.
Yeah. We'll take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
If anything comes up, we'll get you back on if you got some really cool stuff coming up.
Sure. Thank you.
Awesome. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.